Okay, so welcome to this inflation cost and markup session. We're going to have 4 papers for course. So I suggest, unless there's very pressing clarification question, we postpone the question for the 5 to 6 minutes at the end, depending on the presenter. And so we're very happy to have Hassan Afrouzi.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for being here. I will be presenting a paper with Saroj Bhattarai on inflation and GDP dynamics in production networks.
You're speaking on the slide?
Yeah, that's right. Good call. Yes.
Yeah.
So the motivation for the paper is that there's an active literature that thinks about how inflation is propagated through production networks. And we want to contribute to this literature by investigating this question in a dynamic environment. Okay, we want to understand how persistent the response of inflation is to different shocks in the economy when we incorporate the input-output structure of the economy into a standard New Keynesian model. So what we're going to do, we're going to provide analytical characterization of a New Keynesian model with arbitrary production networks and arbitrary price stickiness across sectors. We're going to show that our analytical solutions deliver sufficient statistic for the dynamics of prices in the economy. So we can go out and measure this in the data and think about for the particular network and the particular price stickiness of the US economy, how would the inflation respond from through the lens of a New Keynesian model. Okay. And then we're going to measure it, we're going to quantify how production networks affect the response of the economy's macro variables to monetary and sectoral TFP or red shocks. And then we're going to give a ranking of US sectors based on their contribution to inflation and GDP. Okay, so I'm going to skip literature review and I'm going to just jump into the model to give you a sense of what we're doing. We're going to consider an environment with continuous time. It's going to run forever. There's going to be n industries indexed by I. Think about these as different locations on the network. Every industry is going to have a measure of monopolistically competitive firms within it, like the textbook New Keynesian model. In every sector, a final good producer is going to buy from these intermediate good producers within the sector, package the good of the sector, produce a final good, and sell it to both households and all the other sectors in the economy. So this is just a summary of the environment. I'll show you the problems in a second. And at the end of the production chain, sectoral goods produced by these final good producers is going to be consumed by the household or used for production in other sectors. Okay. That's kind of like the structure. So now going through each block one by one, the household is just going to, there's a representative households that's just going to maximize their lifetime utility. We're going to impose Gauss-Lucas preferences. I'll tell you what that gives us in our benchmark, but then we have extensions in the paper to general preferences. Gauss-Lucas preferences are utility and consumption is log, and then this utility and labor is linear. Household is going to buy from all of these different sectors in the economy. So their total expenditure on each of these final consumption goods produced by sectors, plus how much bonds they hold should be less than or equal to their labor income, plus interest, nominal interest on their nominal bonds, plus some transfers that are going to include lump sum taxes, profits from firms, etc. Where this aggregate consumption index is just going to be an aggregation across these different sectoral limits. We're going to linearize this economy around efficient steady state. So the shape of this P function doesn't really matter as long as you have interior solutions. So imagine that this function is increasing and the utility is increasing in every consumption and there's another condition. So we always have an interior solution. Okay. So then the aggregate price index is just going to be defined because demand is homothetic through this P function is going to be defined as total expenditure divided by aggregate consumption. Right. So we're going to start by just assuming that monetary policy controls nominal GDP. There's an extension with Taylor rules. That's like an endogenous response. in the paper. But this benchmark is very useful because it allows us to kind of investigate the role of monetary policy separately from the propagation of shocks in different sectors. Because a fixed M with these preferences is going to just imply that interest rates are being fixed along the equilibrium path without determinacy issues. So then what Gauss and Lucas preferences give us is that with these preferences, the intertemporal order equation of the household is just going to imply that nominal wages are just equal to nominal GDP. Okay, so that's the, like, that has to hold in the equilibrium. So by controlling nominal GDP in the economy, the central bank is implicitly just fixing the wages. So this kind of like gives us a nice structure to think about if monetary policy could implement any path of wages that we wanted, what would the response of prices be? And then we can always go back and say, now let me add a Taylor rule and make the response of wages partially endogenous to the structure of the economy. So then that's the household and monetary policy. Now I'm going to what's happening in each of these sectors. So in each sector, we're going to have a final good producer that's going to be competitive. So this producer has zero value added. What it does, it just buys from a continuum of intermediate good producers in the sector, packages a final good using a CES aggregator with sector-specific elasticity of substitution, and then sells it to household and all the other sectors that want to use this as an input. Okay? So there's no network here. The network is going to come from these intermediate good producers buying from all of the other sectors and producing using that. So let me show you that. So the firms that this representative final good producer in every sector buys from is a continuum of monopolistically competitive firms, because the demand that comes from the CES of the final goods producer is going to give monopolistic competition power to these firms. Each of these firms are going to produce using a production function that uses labor and also inputs from all the other sectors in the economy. Okay? And there's going to be a Higgs neutral productivity here. Also, because I'm going to linearize the model at the end of the day, just think about shocks as like being paths of deterministic variables with perfect foresight. So the linearized model is just equivalent to a model with uncertainty with perfect foresight. So assuming, again, linearization allows me to assume any function that I want here. At the end of the day, I just need another conditions so that the solution is interior. And also allows me to impose any arbitrary production structure that I want on this economy. Because around that efficient steady state, all that matters in terms of this production function is the expenditure share of firms in every sector on every other sector, which is eventually going to give us our input-output matrix. So that's the production structure. Then pricing is going to be subject to a Calvo friction that in every sector, IID price change opportunities arrive for these monopolistically competitive firms at a Poisson rate theta I. And again, I'm going to allow these theta I's to vary across sectors to capture different price stickiness. So what do these firms do when they're choosing their prices? They consider the fact that when they choose a price, they're going to be stuck with those prices in history. So that's why the pricing decision is forward-looking, like the textbook Keynesian model. They're going to discount future profits at the probability that they're going to be stuck with that price at a horizon H. The interest rate or the stochastic discount rate of the household that's coming from the cumulative interest rate until that point. They're going to have a total revenue implied by that price, and they're going to have a total cost implied by that price that is coming from an expenditure minimization problem that I'm not showing you. So the firm is going to say, in order to produce this much, what is the optimal cost structure? That's a cost minimization problem that's static. And then they're going to maximize these profits subject to the fact that this is a new Keynesian model. So at any point in time, they have to meet the demand that is implied by that price. So it's a Calvo model, but it allows me to heterogeneously impose different price stickiness across sectors. So that's the environment. Okay, so how do we solve this? When I take that economy, you can show that under the proper assumptions for the production functions and the utility function that I showed you, there is a unique fixed point as an efficient steady state. By efficient, I mean we have imposed the subsidies of the New Keynesian model in every sector such that the allocation that prevails in the steady state is the same as the allocation that the planner would choose under no shocks. And then we linearize around that steady state. Okay. So then you can show that even though that we had this like arbitrary structure for production and price stickiness, the whole path of prices in the economy can be summarized by a system of differential equations that's going to have an economic interpretation in a second. But let me tell you what the equation is first. So imagine that we stack all the prices of these different sectors. So every sector has a final good, every final good has a price. So I have n different prices in the economy, stack them together, call that a vector P. So these prices determine all the allocations in this economy at the end of the day. Okay? Those prices are going to be determined, or the evolution of those prices are going to be determined by a system of differential equations that relates the evolution of inflation in this vector to some coefficient that I'm going to go over right now, times the deviation of those prices from a vector of prices that would prevail under flexible prices. Okay? So prices are changing on the left-hand side of this equation according to the gap between prices in the sticky economy and what we would have had in a flexible economy if there was no stickiness. Okay? If everyone is at their like ideal price, then obviously we should have no inflation, right? Because there's no reason, the wedge is closed, there's no reason for inflation to exist. But as long as prices deviate from that optimal or flexible level, they will adjust so that that gap closes. Okay. And there's like, no differential equation is complete without its boundary conditions. What are the boundary conditions here? At time 0, prices cannot move because this is a continuous time model and prices are sticky. So right after a shock, nobody gets to change their price at that moment. And then like in any other New Keynesian model, we're looking for an equilibrium where we go back to the steady state that we came from. So at the end of the day, if all prices are being determined by this equation and prices are a sufficient statistic for the allocations in this economy, then I just need to know what this vector of flexible prices are. And I need to know what this coefficient is. So this coefficient is going to depend on two key set of parameters. One, the stickiness of prices in every sector. Let me stack that on a vector called that, stack that on the diagonal matrix called that theta. So that summarizes price stickiness across different sectors. Intuitively, evolution of prices should also depend on how much each sector buys from another sector. Okay? So that's going to be this matrix A, which is going to be the matrix of expenditure shares of every sector from every other sector. So the ijth element of this matrix is how much expenditure, what is the expenditure share of sector I on sector J? That's our input-output matrix in the sufficient steady state on the point of approximation. Okay. Finally, what is the expression for this PTF? PTF is going to depend on wages, because of Gauss-Lucas preferences. This wage is just equal to our money supply or nominal GDP, plus the inverse Leontief matrix times wages or productivities. Okay, because of the setup that I have, wages and productivities from the perspective of the flexible equilibrium don't really are not really distinguished. The only reason that we would put different notation for these was if we were talking about an efficient versus inefficient allocation. But this gives us like what we know from the flexible economies with network structure. Pass-through of productivity shocks is governed by inverse Leontief. Pass-through of nominal shocks is just governed by one-to-one because there's monetary neutrality in those economies. So if you look at this equation, everything here is exogenous at the moment because monetary policy is directly setting M either exogenously or as a function of the shocks. And shocks are just by definition exogenous. So my differential equation has a force term, which is governed by the shocks, and a coefficient that depends on price stickiness and the input-output structure. which also means that I have arrived into a sufficient statistic result, because if I know theta and if I know the input-output structure, and I take a path of shocks as given, I know how the economy, prices in the economy will evolve over time. So let's talk about that a little bit. What is the economic significance of this equation? Let me take this matrix theta squared times I minus A that shows up in my equation and call that gamma. That's going to be a key matrix here. We're going to call that the duration adjusted Leontief matrix. This I minus A component is the Leontief matrix. Theta has these Calvo parameters in them that in the data we can measure as a duration between price changes in different sectors. So we call this the duration adjusted Leontief. So the significance of this duration adjusted Leontief matrix is that it's the slope of the sectoral Phillips curves of this economy. Why the sectoral Phillips curves? Because if I take the deviation of prices from this PTF flexible prices, I can decompose it to a vector of relative price gaps and pull out an output gap from it, which is usually how we see this equation in the previous literature. Papers like Aoki or 2001, which considered a sticky and a flexible sector economy, or Bedinio, where he was thinking about monetary unions. This is like a generalized version of those economies with input-output structure and arbitrary price stickiness across sectors. But we see that again, like evolution of inflation depends on output gap, depends on these relative price gaps. If I have a one sector economy, there's only one price, so these relative price gaps are closed already. So I would have inflation evolves according to the output gap. Now, in a one sector economy, we also know that if you close inflation gap, if you close the output gap, you close inflation. If you close inflation, you close the output gap. But when you have these relative price distortions, then that's not the case anymore. You can have a policy that closes the output gap, but they still get inflation because these relative prices are distorted, which is a very fundamental insight that doesn't really relate to networks, but here's a manifestation of that in a Phillips curve. And then by definition, because these are relative prices, on average, they have to be zero according to some weights, but their dispersion can create inflation, which is also an insight that you see in Lorenzoni and Werning's recent paper on the conflict inflation. When there's disagreement in relative prices, we get inflation. So because we just discussed in the last proposition that this uniquely describes the path of prices, this Phillips curve is uniquely determining the path of prices given a path for shocks, and all shocks affect the price dynamics only through this force term PTF. Okay? So it doesn't matter if I'm thinking about TFP shocks, wage shocks, or money supply shocks, all of them are affecting the evolution of inflation across sectors through this object. Okay, so we have, let me skip that. So we have a general solution for the path of prices as a path of any path of shocks that you want to consider. But what I'm going to do in the next couple of slides is to just show you that if I consider the path of shocks that I usually do for impulse response functions, what those impulse response functions are going to be. So consider, let's start one by one. Consider a monetary shock that at time zero, we're in the steady state. There's a monetary shock that increases the level of aggregate wages by 1%, and then stays there. Then prices eventually has to increase by 1% because in the long run, I should have neutrality. At time zero, prices don't increase because no one has had a chance to change their prices. But how fast do we get there depends on the square root of this gamma matrix that I was telling you. Okay? And let me just skip the intuition of why the square root shows up, because the square root shows up just one sentence because prices are partly set in a forward-looking way, but not fully, because you take into account that with some probability you will change your prices in the future. So that's why the square root shows up. But to summarize, the persistence of the sectoral prices in this economy is determined by the square root of this duration adjusted Leontief matrix. So then from this, we can take the derivative, get to inflation, multiply it by expenditure shares, get to the CPI inflation. And then once we know inflation, we can calculate the GDP gap as a function of that. All of these, because prices are determined by the square root of gamma, all of these other objects are also going to be captured by that. Now, this one captures the fact that with respect to a monetary shock, all prices should rise by 1% in the long run. Now, if I go to sectoral shocks, the persistence part is going to stay the same. The only thing that's going to change is that what should happen in the long run is no longer the fact that prices should increase by 1%, but the fact that in the long run, the pass-through should depend on inversely on TF multiplied by the sectoral shock that's happening in the economy. Okay? So similar formulas with different long-run pass-throughs for sectoral shocks. Skip that. I just want to skip that. So I just want to talk for 3 minutes about quantifying this. So once we know that impulse responses are being driven by this gamma matrix or the square root of this gamma matrix, the only question becomes, okay, let's go measure that in the data. Both of them are observable and see what happens for the US economy. So we can construct the gamma matrix that had two components. One was the sectoral frequencies of price changes that comes from this paper by Schoenle and Weber. And the input-output structure comes from the input-output tables of the US. Okay, we have some results for aggregate monetary neutrality, but let me show you the response of sectoral inflation rates to a monetary shock. So suppose we're hitting the economy with a monetary shock. We want to understand what happens to inflation in different sectors. So this is like an insight that just comes from the long-run neutrality of money, but it's worth mentioning that if you have a sector where prices are flexible, obviously that sector will respond more in the beginning. Okay? But then all prices should raise the same amount in the long run in response to a monetary shock. So if you're increasing your prices by a lot in the beginning, you should have a more transitory response. So that's what we see here. Oil is a very flexible sector. It increases by a lot in the beginning, but it dies out faster. Whereas semiconductor or machinery manufacturing is a very sticky sector. So it has a very dampened response in the beginning, but it's very persistent over time. Okay? And the key is that these persistences are determined by the structure of the network, depends on some expenditure shares, and the price stickiness in that sector. Expressions in the. So what this does, it gives different sectors disproportionate effects for monetary neutrality. So sectors that have a more persistent response end up contributing more to monetary neutrality. To manifest this, let me do the following exercise. Let me rank sectors based on the persistence of their responses to a monetary shock and drop the 3 most persistent sectors from my analysis. They happen to be sectors that have almost combined 0 expenditure share. So in an economy without a network, they would have no inflationary impact, no effect on aggregate GDP. But in this economy, if I just drop them from my analysis and assume that my network doesn't have these sectors, the response of aggregate GDP in total decreases by 16%, even though that they had 0 expenditure share. So even though that there's a trade-off between the impact response of inflation to a monetary shock versus its persistence, what really governs the effect of each sector on aggregate GDP response or GDP gap response is their persistence, which depends on the network and price stickiness. Okay. We have some results in the paper for sectoral shocks as well, but I'm gonna just stop there and just wait for questions. If not, I will spend 1 minute to explain.
Yeah, so we have time for questions. Thanks, Hassan.
Yeah.
I have a basic question about your first result. So, I guess 2 questions. You were assuming ROI is 0. Can you remind us what that is? Is the persistence of the shock, I'm guessing?
No, it's the discount factor. So it's a ROI equals 0 essentially is equivalent to assuming beta is very close to 1.
And it's potentially dumb question. So in the discrete version of the Keynesian model, you have this expectation of the Phillips curve. So inflation depends on expected inflation. And that didn't seem to be the case in your expression.
No, it's here, but it's incorporated in continuous time. So first of all, I have perfect foresight. So the discrete version of this would be pi t equals pi t plus 1 plus something. I don't have the expectation there. And then imagine you take pi t to the other side. It just says that changes in inflation is proportional to the output gap, which is where that comes from.
So you have perfect foresight.
Yeah. related to your first question, there is, so the role of like rho equal to 0 is not innocuous. If you think that firm sectors are myopic, dynamics changes because you're not forward looking in your price setting anymore. And look at the student on the market this year who thought about that, the different degrees of myopia affects the persistence of inflation in these models. But we don't do that in this paper.
Other question? So I was thinking in the quantitative exercise that you do, is this, so if we were to think of, part of the inflation surge in the US comes from sectoral shocks that have, large and persistent aggregate impact. So what should, is this a plausible story? Which are the parameters that we should take a look at to understand whether those sectoral shocks can have, large and persistent impact?
Yeah, so we need one more intermediate step from like the last result I showed you to that question, which is that I showed you in isolate. I didn't show you the sectoral responses, but I showed you how monetary policy affects prices. Then you're going to have a sectoral shock, and that's going to affect prices in a particular way, but still according to the square root of gamma matrix. And then you have to pair, like if you have a sectoral shock, you have to take a stance what monetary policy is doing. But at the end of the day, all of that persistence is going to be determined by this particular interaction of price stickiness and input-output structure that is given by the frequency adjust or the duration adjusted of the anti-F matrix. We have some theorems in the paper that give like analytical expressions for that I didn't show you today. But it depends, and like to summarize, it depends on three things. Firms take into account how persistent the shock itself is going to be. So that affects, like, if I'm a sticky sector, I don't want to respond to an oil shock because I'm going to be stuck with it for a long time. But at the same time, if I'm a sticky sector, fixing the persistence of the shock, if I'm a sticky sector and I buy mostly from flexible sectors, then again, I don't want to really respond to an oil shock because my suppliers will adjust before me. But conditional on me responding, which is essentially like the network explanation of recent inflation, is that whatever happened to supply chain caused inflation. Conditional on that happening, then the persistence of inflation is going to be driven by these sectors that have the lowest duration adjusted frequency. So you'll take like sticky sectors that are very influential in the network. Again, we give a formula for that in the paper.
All right.
Yeah, we can.
In the expressions, I never saw something about like the derivatives of the preference function, the big phi, and you said like it didn't matter much or something, but shouldn't the derivatives around the steady state enter some expression for like the equivalent of the ice curve in this?
So if like that's the point of the efficient steady state, because the envelope theorem applies there. So the elasticities of the function don't matter, but the expenditure shares that it implies matters, right? So if you have an inefficient economy, the elasticity should absolutely matter. But the point of the envelope theorem around the efficient steady state is that as long as I know the expenditure shares, I know exactly what the price level should be.
And those were the A's that were inside of the gamma.
Those were the beta. The A's were like coming from the production function of sectors, and from phi, we were getting the expenditure share of the household on different sectors. I was calling them betas, but I didn't really talk about them. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay.
All right, thank you. Hi, everyone. First, many thanks to the organizers for putting this paper in the program. This is joint work with a number of my colleagues at the Cleveland Fed, them being at Knotek, Mathieu Pedemonte and Rob Rich, as well as John Leer, who is the chief economist at Morning Consult, and Raphael Schoenle, who is a professor at Brandeis University, and the usual disclaimer applies. So what this paper is about is really the interaction between inflation expectations and income growth expectations and the nature of the causality between the two, if there exists one. And eventually, this is a relevant question in the current economic environment, not only for the US, but beyond it, where we're still observing persistently high inflation that's way above the long-term FOMC target and tight labor markets. So therefore, discussions on potential wage price spirals, they have yet resurfaced. On the other hand, there's a number of different surveys that are finding that consumers, they have this tendency to dislike inflation. Well, how do we know that? They typically associate high inflation with worse economic outcomes. And there's a number of different surveys that are showing that. However, the mechanisms behind the rationale why consumers have this negative association of inflation with economic outcomes remains largely unknown. And we believe that we need to better understand the role that inflation expectations have for consumers in order to get to the bottom of this. And in particular, an overlooked channel has been labor markets. We were in fact quite a bit surprised to see that there's literally a handful of papers out there that discuss the role of inflation expectations for labor market decisions. And eventually wants to think about inflation and labor market. An organic question is whether nominal wage rigidities matter for how households perceive inflation. So in the present paper, we're going to try to touch on all of these questions and give an answer to them. And we're going to do so by relying on a representative sample of the US population to first simultaneously measure households' inflation expectations and income growth expectations, and then implement a novel experimental setting to assess the causal link between the two. In the final part of the paper, we're going to incorporate our empirical findings into a very standard, taken off the shelf, New Keynesian model with nominal wage rigidity and search and matching frictions, where importantly here, the nominal wage rigidity will be calibrated so that we match the pass-through from inflation expectations to income growth expectations. And I'll just say it right here as a remark that will be sort of our only contribution when it comes to the model. So the model, why do we need it? The model is there to assess the macroeconomic implications of what we find empirically. And second, for us to try to understand the mechanism behind why consumers dislike inflation. So on the empirical front, let me give you a preview of our results. We're going to find causal yet moderate relationship that runs from inflation expectations to income growth expectations at the level of only about 20%. So I think if I increase consumers' inflation expectations exogenously by 1 percentage point, then their income growth expectations would only increase by 0.2 percentage points. So that is already giving us some hints that current nominal wage rigidities seem to be feeding into how consumers perceive the relationship between inflation and income growth in the future. This pass-through will have some heterogeneity when it comes to sociodemographic factors. For instance, we find an insignificant pass-through for women and low-income respondents, but the pass-through is a little bit higher than the average for high-income and male consumers. And finally, we are going to find that inflation expectations will exert only small causal impacts on labor market actions. And in fact, the only significant effect that we're going to find is that increases in inflation expectations happening exogenously will result in very small increases in the likelihood that our consumers apply for another job. Important to note here is that we find no effects in their likelihood to ask for a raise to their current employer or work longer hours. And the former is still sort of reinforcing for us the idea that people are facing quite a bit of nominal wage rigidity that eventually feeds into their projections on the relationship between inflation and income growth in the future. On the model front, we're going to run the analysis relative to a counterfactual of a unit pass-through from inflation expectations to income growth expectations. And relative to that, the estimated less than unity pass-through will give the following results. If we shock the model with inflationary shocks coming from a demand side, we're going to see that our consumers will be suffering from lower utility because they are being motivated or forced to work longer hours at a lower real wage. If the inflationary shock is coming from the supply side, the link between output and inflation will get even more reinforced. Generally, higher nominal wage rigidity will yield to a less positive or a more negative association between inflation and utility expectations, and I'll be very clear about that. And finally, we're going to find no macroeconomic effects coming from the pass-through of inflation expectations into labor market actions in a macro level. So let me jump right into the experimental setting. So the first wave of this RCT experiment was run in February 2022. We surveyed about 7,000 respondents. We also had a follow-up later on, which we call the second wave in September 2022, that completely validated what we initially found. So the first step of the survey is that we're going to collect prior inflation and income growth expectations. And then in the second step, we're going to randomly assign our respondents into 6 different groups. There's going to be a control group and 5 different information treatment groups. Then we're going to collect everybody back together, and we're going to re-ask them the posterior expectations, both on inflation and income growth. And we're also going to ask them about some labor market actions. And all of this, right, you enter the survey in one in an hour. Let's say there's nothing happening in between the prior and the posterior, but the inflation treatments. Sorry, the information treatments. Okay, so the prior questions, first, let me get started with the inflation expectations prior questions. So we're going to rely on a novel measure of indirect consumer inflation expectations, which we now call by the acronym of ICIE. This has been a joint project between Morning Consult and the Cleveland Fed. We measure these inflation expectations on a weekly basis, and we get about 20,000 respondents. The idea behind the question is to rely on the indirect utility theory to infer inflation expectations from consumers. I'll be very happy to answer questions around this new measure, but for now, let me just say what we're asking them. So given your expectations about developments in prices of goods and services during the next 12 months, how would your income have to change to make you equally well off relative to your current situation so that you can buy the same amount of goods and services as you do today? And you can opt for an increase, stay about the same, or decrease. To give you an idea, this is the evolution of this ICIE measure over time since its birth by the end of February 2021. So once inflation started picking up, so did this measure. For a little bit of more background or context on how this measure relates to what we call conventional inflation expectations, such as the Michigan or the New York Fed. As you can see, we're also able to be pretty close to what the other surveys are getting at. In terms of income growth, we're going to use what we like to call a plain vanilla now type of a question. We're just asking them whether they expect their income to increase, decrease, or stay about the same over the next 12 months. And in terms of the information treatments, eventually there's going to be a control group that gets no information treatment. There's going to be a group that will be getting some information about the Fed's long-term inflation target. There will be another group that receives information about expected wage growth in 2022, according to the conference board. Another group that will be receiving information about realized CPI growth in 2021. Another group that will be receiving some information about expected inflation by the end of 2022, according to the SPF. And there's going to be also a placebo group that receives some information regarding the US population, that's there just to understand whether people are reacting to any piece of information, regardless of whether that is related to what we're trying to get to here. Once we have that, we're going to collect everybody and ask them posterior questions in terms of inflation expectations. We'll rely on the Michigan survey of consumers. So we'll ask them in the next year whether they think prices in general will increase, decrease, or stay about the same. And here, eventually, you notice that the questions used before and after, they're different. People that are experts in these type of experiments, they always suggest you do this so that people do not feel like they're being tested and they need to remember the answer that they gave during the prior question. So this is a common strategy in the literature. And for income growth expectations, we're going to move the annual forecast horizon forward by 3 quarters. So the posterior question reads, between December 2022 and 2023, do you expect your income to increase, decrease, or stay about the same? So anyway, this is the setting of the experiment. We collect the data, and in a final step, we're also going to ask them about labor market actions, in particular, how likely they are to do any of the following three options in order to increase their income, so they can apply for a job that pays more, work longer hours, ask for a raise. They need to rate each one of those options from very unlikely to very likely. If none of those fits them, they can just describe with their own words what they're going to do. So now let me get to the empirical strategy. So the very first thing that we needed to do is essentially validate treatments, whether treatments are actually moving our inflation expectations around. And in order to do so, right, what we're eventually going to do is just regress the posterior. First, let's get to inflation expectations, right? What we're going to do is regress posterior inflation expectations on the prior, on a dummy T, which takes value 1 if you received a particular treatment, 0 otherwise, as well as the interaction between the treatment dummy and the prior. Okay, and we're going to run a similar regression for testing whether information treatments have had any effect on income growth expectations. And validating treatments for the purposes of our empirical strategy will be extremely important, because we're going to use that exogenous variation that is coming in inflation expectations or income growth expectations, right, as an instrument to understand the causal effect of one variable in expectations on the other, right? So treatments are in fact validated, particularly for inflation expectations. So I'd like to focus your attention on columns 2 for inflation expectations and 4 for income growth expectations. So here I'm showing just the theta estimates. Happy to open up the other slide on the gamma estimates. So this is the interaction, right, between the treatment dummy, whether you've been treated or not, right, the particular information treatment, and the prior. And in red here, we're highlighting all of the treatments that actually have moved around inflation expectations. Okay, and all of them have had, you know, some effect apart from the placebo. But then if you compare that column with column number 4, you can see that income growth expectations are actually very hard to move around. In fact, unless you give them information about wages itself, right, none of the other thetas are statistically significant. Okay. Now, what are we going to do with this? So we're going again to use this exogenous variation in expectation that's coming due to treatments to pin down the causal effect of one variable to the other. Okay, so if I want to, for instance, figure out what is the effect of inflation expectations on income growth expectations, what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to build an instrument, right? And my instrument is shown right here in this equation, that is going to be equal to just the variation in inflation expectations that's coming from the treatment dummy and its interaction with the prior, whenever, right, I'm receiving any information, any information treatment that is relevant to inflation. So either SPF, past CPI, or the long-term target, and 0 otherwise. And then in the second stage, what I'm going to do is estimate, right, the effect of the posterior inflation expectations on posterior income growth expectations while controlling for the prior and instrumenting for posterior inflation expectations using the instrument up here. And I'm going to do analogous steps for the other direction. Okay, what are we going to find? This is maybe the punchline slide of the paper. And so focusing again here on columns 2 and 4, the effect going from inflation expectations to income growth expectations is statistically significant. It's about 0.2. So we're, you know, significantly away from unity. And then interestingly, going into column number 4, the coefficient, it's not negligible, right? But it's statistically insignificant. So Then what we're going to do is essentially repeat the same exercise, but then we can start discriminating by demographic characteristics. And we're going to find that this pass-through is slightly higher for men at about 27%. It's quite a bit higher for higher income respondents at about 34%, but the pass-through remains quite insignificant for women and lower income respondents. So overall, the way that we're going to interpret this is that people are expecting lower real wages because their inflation expectations are being shocked. And sort of the idea being that I'm facing current nominal wage rigidity and I'm fixing that nominal wage rigidity into the future. So whenever I expect inflation to go up, I'm expecting my real income growth to get depressed. We're going to apply a similar strategy when it comes to understanding the effect of inflation expectations on labor market actions. So similar strategy to before. What we're going to regress now is a particular labor market action J on the posterior inflation expectations while instrumenting for it using the same instrument that I showed earlier. As a first result, we established that there is no causal effect coming from inflation expectations on our consumers working longer hours or asking their current employer for a raise. And our second result is that there is only a small causal effect of inflation expectations on the likelihood that our consumers apply for another job in order to increase their income. And quantitatively, that effect is such that the 1 percentage point increase in inflation expectations will yield only 0.11 percentage points increase in the likelihood that our respondents apply to another job in order to increase their income. Now, in the course of the past year, we have run a number of robustness checks, as I mentioned earlier. In September of last year, we repeated the exact same experiment, of course, with some updated treatments. And we find almost the exact same results as we did on the first wave. In September 2022, the pass-through, the estimated pass-through was about 0.17. So very close to 0.20, and the rest of the results, they remain qualitatively the same. Another robustness check that we recently ran in actually just last month was to try to show that actually the choice of the prior question for inflation expectations is not important in determining the level of pass-through from inflation expectations to income growth expectations. And there we did run a much smaller in size RCT experiment where we gave our respondents both the ICIE question as well as the New York Fed question to infer inflation expectations. And finally, let me get to the new Keynesian model. So an overview of what we do here. This will be a general equilibrium model with search and matching frictions in labor markets. Really, the model has been taken off the shelf from Christoffel and Quester and another of his papers with co-authors. A few things to keep in mind here is that eventually treatments, they're moving around inflation expectations, even though we're giving them what is publicly available information. So that means that that our consumers are not fully aware, right? They do not have perfect information around what's going on. So in the model, we're going to be consistent with that by introducing some information stickiness in inflation expectations in similar spirit to Make and Rice paper. There's going to be nominal wage rigidity. So in every period, I won't be able to renegotiate my nominal wage with some probability. If there is no renegotiation, nominal wages partially adjust to past inflation. Importantly here, we're going to calibrate this wage rigidity and adjustment to past inflation to match the empirical pass-through. And important to note is that higher pass-through in the model will always be associated with lower nominal wage rigidity. So with the model, we do a bunch of things, but what I wanted to show today is an application with what we do with simulated data from the model. So what we're going to do is simulate our model for many pairs of wage non-renegotiation probability. I'm going to call that gamma, and wage adjustment to past inflation zeta W. Right, and in the model, what I'm going to do is simulate expected utility and expected inflation for all of these many different pairs. We use about 50 different pairs of gamma and zeta W. And what I'm going to try to understand is the role that gamma plays for the relationship between expected utility and expected inflation within the model setting. And regardless of whether I'm shocking the model with a cost push shock or a demand shock, right? So regardless of whether inflation is coming from the supply or the demand side, right? What I'm highlighting here in red is that having higher nominal wage rigidity really depresses, so it either makes it less positive or turns it into negative, the relationship between expected utility and expected inflation. Okay, and I'll maybe leave the concluding remarks here and open the floor to questions.
Okay, thank you. Now, so, yes.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks. So I guess your setup does not allow us to check for asymmetry, right? When the inflation expectations go up or go down. But what you could do probably explore whether there are non-linearities, right? Because in essence, with a linear setting, you imply that workers are ready to accept no real weighted open employment. So maybe there is you can explore about variation across individuals to check for non-linearity. And the second question on the similar arrangement is how much of what you find is due to future forward-looking, expectations of inflation, or let's say perceived inflation, in period T or T-1. Because you assume that individuals, right, that perceive inflation as being high in period T will also extrapolate that, for future periods. So it might be just, they expect that their real wages would not compensate for the perceived power loss in period T. So I think you could just control for that if you have that.
So let me start from the asymmetry. So that's a good point. So again, I mean, yeah. So in the paper, in the main result, right? So the interpretation is that you can go 1 percentage point higher or lower, right? And the effect would be again symmetric. It's an interesting point that we haven't eventually incorporated in the RCP experiment. Regarding the perceived, so we don't have data on how people perceive, right, current inflation. Again, so maybe I wasn't clear, but what I meant in terms of perceptions and how they project things, it's about current nominal wage rigidity, right? Whatever you perceive as being your probability of not being able to renegotiate your wages sort of being projected into the future, not current or current perceived inflation being projected into the future. Here, all that matters, right, is that we want to introduce some exogenous variation, which in reality, right, it's very hard to do otherwise in expected 1 year ahead inflation. I don't have a clear answer if things would look different if we were to think about current perceived inflation, but it's certainly an interesting thing to look at.
I had a question about the people that are in the experiment, because you said they're representative of the US population, but do you have any sense of how many of them are like price makers? Like how many people are actually like business owners or working certain things that could, because then you use those in the model, and in the model there are, I don't know if there's anything of heterogeneity between people who may be firm owners compared to other more like general population.
Right, so that is something that we can certainly check. I don't have an answer for you right now, but we can certainly check that. And it's also whether there's people in our sample that are business owners that might have a different perspective on this, and that might actually be an interesting thing to look at. because maybe sort of, their view of the world is somewhat different from what a typical
Yeah.
consumer that doesn't own.
Yeah, even if they're like properly, what do you say, balanced and controlling the treatment group, like within the treatment group, you can also see, yeah.
Yes.
I wasn't sure whether one was the correct benchmark, so it would be interesting, I think, to go into US time series and just run a simple correlation between wage inflation and price inflation. Just to see, is it around 0.2? Maybe it's actually, somewhere between 0.2 and 1, and then that tells you something about
Especially
whether
at
they're
their
fine.
point, yes. I mean, yeah, because what that would mean is that people, after all, might not be irrational in the way that they think about
Right.
nominal wage or the relationship.
The question was related to that. So in the model, even in the long run, they're assuming that if there's a shock to inflation, only 0.2 passes to their income. So they're losing like 0.8 kind of real
Yeah,
wage.
it's a long, yes, it's a parameter that's not, it's fixed over time. I think it's a constant, the gamma is a constant. So it's forever there.
But does the model have like capital or some other income? Because otherwise, in the long run, the change in the real wage has to equal the change in prices. If
Yes,
there's
so there's capital in the model. I mean, the model is, it's fairly, it's not, I mean, it's an off-the-shelf model, but it has a number of bells and whistles that allows for that. But I mean, there, the important thing is that it means that your wage, in a sense, will never be able to catch
But
up.
then the capital owners are getting like super rich relative to the workers, and then that like this,
That's actually something that we can certainly check in the model and maybe show some.
the heterogeneity would be super important for the model welfare implications. So it depends on how you rebate the income of capital. I don't know.
But so sorry, because is it like what they perceive, or is it what that firms are going to do? So are they, wrongly perceiving that the real wage is going to be lower for the same
I mean, so,
time,
right,
or will the firm?
so in the value function, right, there's some probability that you are eventually going to remain in your current job. And if you do so, this is, so here we don't have any on-the-job search, right? Others, you could either be employed or unemployed, right? And there's some exogenous probability that you're going to get separated from the labor force, from the labor market, become unemployed. And in the value function, right, your expected wage growth, right, will never be able. I mean, it will not. It will only be sort of 0.2 times. So essentially, you're losing 80% of your real income, real wage growth.
No, one reason why you ask for indirect inflation expectation using their income is we know there's so many problems if you ask them overall price in general, right? But I see in one of the survey questions you introduced, how do you see the overall price in general? Right. So I know you are trying to not repeat the same question. Would that advise your result? Or
So,
what if you just use indirect inflation expectation? By the way, I really like it from my perspective, right? So would the result change?
so I mean, what would be the option that you suggest? Sort of flip so what we use now is a posterior being the prior, and what we use. So I can tell you what we know from the very recent RCP experiment that we ran as of last month, that at least the choice of the prior, right, indirect consumer inflation expectations versus something else, which we went with the New York Fed SE, it doesn't matter for the estimation.
Yeah, so this is because we are really stuck in high inflation environment or household representation. Maybe that can explain why their overall price inflation expectation is highly correlated with your indirect inflation expectation. I imagine in stable and low inflation environment, your measure will be much better to capture their inflation expectations.
I mean, so what you want, right, is somewhat like you want some good correlation, but you also do not. I mean, you want the treatments to have some effect, right? So you want whatever your prior is giving you, you want it to be somewhat different from what the posterior is giving you. Otherwise, if the treatments are working.
Right.
But yeah, so again, the ICIE is pretty, I mean, it's doing a pretty good job at capturing at the very least the trends of the other types of inflation expectation questions. But
Okay, so thank you very much.
thank you.
On to the next presentation. by Jean-
Okay, so I want to start by thanking the organizers for adding the paper on the program. It's really a pleasure to present it. This is called Can Supply Shocks Be Inflationary with a Flat Phillips Curve? And it's joint work with Gregory Phelan. So let me set the stage by laying down two facts about business cycle data, in particular in regards to inflation. Fact number one is the Phillips curve is very flat. Think about the housing bubble of the early 2000s. Think about the Great Recession. Think about QE 1, 2, 3, and 4. Those were episodes where either the output gap was very large or there was a forceful amount of monetary easing. And despite those developments, inflation remained very stable. Okay, there's now a growing literature looking at the slope of the Phillips curve and trying to measure it empirically. Fact number two is supply shocks are inflationary. Think about the 70s. Think about what's happening now. And so the starting point of the paper is going to be to point out that despite these facts being important in our opinion to characterize inflation dynamic, it turns out that standard models cannot account for these two facts at the same time. So why is that? If you have a model that gives you a flat Phillips curve, then it means your price level is very rigid. But if your price level is very rigid, then you cannot have inflation from supply shocks. Okay, and so this is a general statement about a shortcoming of standard models. That includes the Calvo model, the Taylor model, the Rothenberg model, Menikoff's model. So to kind of like zoom, if you want, I'm going to do this very quickly during the presentation. If you zoom into the New Keynesian model as an illustration, if you want to get inflation, if you want to have a flat Phillips curve in the New Keynesian model, but at the same time have inflation when supply shocks hits, then you're going to have to be willing to assume an unreasonable side rising costs in order to get very small effects on inflation. So to give you an order, kind of an idea of the orders of magnitude, if you take benchmark estimates about the slope of the Phillips curve in the literature, that means that you're going to have to assume that, for example, markups increase, the desired markup of firms increase by 500% to get just a rise on the inflation of 1%. Okay, so this is kind of like, in our opinion, kind of a shortcoming that motivates the paper. So what we're going to propose in this paper? What we're going to propose is basically, in the data, there's evidence. So the data wants a model that has two features. Number one, prices are sticky when demand shifts, but at the same time, prices are flexible when the supply shifts. So in other words, the data speaks in favor of an idea of shock dependence in the price inflation, in the reaction of the price level, in the reaction of prices. So this idea is different from the idea of time dependence, also different from the idea of state dependence. This is kind of a different idea that we're going to entertain in this paper is shock dependence. So really what matters is the type of shock that hits the economy to whether prices are just or not. And so the name of the game here, the contribution is going to be to provide a micro foundation for a shock-dependent price inflation. And so how we're going to do this, we're going to have a model that has rational actors, but the idea is going to be that firms and consumers engage in a strategic interaction that is going to deliver two results. Number one, firms are going to be able to pass on cost increases to consumers, but at the same time, they're going to avoid increasing prices when demand increases. And the intuition for this is going to be the undue increase in profits problem. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit more about what this idea for the shock-dependent pricing friction is. So in the model we're going to consider, firms are going to have superior information about the aggregate shocks buffeting the economy. Among consumers, some consumers are going to be uninformed. So to clarify, we don't need all consumers to be uninformed. We can have some consumers being informed, but we want a fraction of the consumers not to be informed about the aggregate shocks. And so the firm is going to be setting a price. It's going to be a monopolistic firm setting a price. So this situation in which the firm has superior information on the one hand, and also at the same time is setting a price, is immediately going to lead to a strategic firm-consumer interaction. And in this interaction that is strategic, what I want your attention to zoom into is firm incentives, because firm incentives are going to be the source of the pricing friction. And so the point of the presentation is to explain why firm incentives are different in demand shocks and supply shocks, and how that can lead to shock dependence. So let me try to explain that. First, the demand shock case, then the supply shock case. So what happens in the demand shock case, and what are the incentives of the firm in the demand shock? So the demand shock is going to be modeled in a very standard way, a discount factor shock. And this discount factor shock is going to change aggregate nominal demand. So for the purpose of the exposition, let me talk about the effects of the shock as determining whether it is a good time to buy or not. Now, by assumption, the firm is informed about aggregate shocks, and some consumers are uninformed. And remember that the firm is posting a price. So the price is going to work potentially as a signal of what the firm knows. So in other words, the firm is going to be, the price, excuse me, is going to be a suggestion of how much to spend. And what are the incentives here? So the firm, because of this setup, the firm is going to have an incentive to stimulate demand. So in other words, the firm would like to increase prices in hopes of convincing the uninformed consumers that it's a good time to buy, because that increases profits of the firm. So the question that we need to ask is, can flexible prices be a perfect Bayesian equilibrium in this case? And the result is going to be that if many consumers are uninformed, this cannot be an equilibrium. Why? The reason is price increases are not credible, right? Why not? Because even if it's not a good time to buy, the firm has an incentive to increase prices and to try to convince the uninformed consumers that it's a good time to buy. But the consumers being rational, Bayesian consumers understand the incentives of the firm, and therefore this cannot be a sequential equilibrium. So in other words, this argument explains that there is a strategic friction, and therefore price stickiness is going to arise. So I have not given the intuition or the explanation of why stickiness arises. I'm going to do that when I show you the model, but I have explained why there's a strategic friction when there's a demand shock. And the reason is the firm cannot credibly increase prices when it has superior information. And so to preview the result, there's a cutoff of price adjustment in the fraction of informed consumers. When enough consumers are informed, the firm can adjust prices, because then the firm can credibly adjust the price. So you can have the flexible price equilibrium be sustainable. Okay, so this type of result is the same that arises in some of my previous work. Now, the key thing is to understand why supply shocks are radically different in this environment. Okay, let's consider that. What are the incentives of the firm? So a supply shock is going to be modeled as a shock to the firm's costs. And let's have the same information structure as before. If you want, we can assume even that all consumers are uninformed. And so what is crucial to notice is that the shock in this case is not payoff relevant to the consumer, because the consumer doesn't care about the cost of the firm. So that's something that is intrinsic to the firm. The consumer only cares about the price that it sees and how much they consume, right? So that means because the shock is not payoff relevant now, the firm cannot stimulate demand by raising prices, different from the demand shock, right? And so therefore, what are firm incentives here? The firm simply doesn't have an incentive to stimulate demand because simply that's not possible. And so the question that if you ask the same question as before, can flexible prices be a perfect Bayesian equilibrium? The answer is yes, for any amount of information among consumers, in fact. And the reason is price increases are credible. A price increase leads to a lower demand, but it's necessary due to the higher costs. And in fact, that's what profit maximization determines. Right, and so in other words, different from this demand shocks case, there's no strategic friction here, and there are flexible prices. So as I promised at the beginning, two slides ago, what is key to understand is what are firm's incentives. Firm incentives are such that under demand shocks, you have price stickiness, you have this strategic friction. With supply shocks, you don't have that, so you have price flexibility. So this model that I'm going to set up leads to shock dependence in the adjustment of prices. So if you want, this kind of like, I don't know what you're gonna think about this, but this is kind of like what this model is after. It's like, you've probably seen a lot of this type of signs. Oh, we're increasing prices because our costs have increased. What the model is explaining is why this type of messages are credible. Why is it credible for firms to increase prices when demand increases? So that was the introduction. I'm going to go back very quickly to the motivation within the New Keynesian model. And Hassan, I'm going to take your question at the end, or
It was just a clarifying question.
Yeah, go ahead.
What do you mean by stimulating demand? You're shifting the demand curve?
yes, shifting the demand curve. Because remember, so the idea is here, the firm has more information, right? And so the firm would like to. The question is, can the firm stimulate demand? The firm wants to do that. The firm knows more about the aggregate shocks. And so the firm knows, so to speak, that there's inflation elsewhere. And the firm tell me, look, there's inflation elsewhere. I'm going to raise my price. That's not credible. So that's the point. Okay, this is what I mean by the firm wants to stimulate demand, shift the demand curve. The firm cannot do that because this is a credibility issue. That's what gives you the strategic friction.
Can I also ask a clarifying question?
Yeah.
Very quick. Are you assuming that consumers know whether it's a supply or a demand shock, or they're?
I don't need to assume that. In the explanation I just gave, I was assuming that for simplicity, but I don't need to do that. So in the full model, I'm going to have two shocks at the same time, and the price in equilibrium is going to be indexed to the supply shock. So it's going to flexibly move with the supply shock, but at the same time sticking with respect to demand. So it's not going to adjust to the demand. Yeah, so I don't need to make that assumption, but I was making it for the sake of the explanation. So, like I was saying, let me quickly go over the motivation within the New Keynesian model, and then I'm going to go to the full model of shock dependence. So, what's going on in the New Keynesian model? So, as all of you know, structural New Keynesian Phillips curve is written this way. Here you have the output gap, the slope of the Phillips curve, and this is the markup shock, right? So, the point here is estimates from both kappa and lambdas is just a very flat Phillips curve. So this guy is estimated to put 0.0020, either in the DFG literature or in the kind of regional identification literature, you get very low numbers. So what this means is, the literature typically proceeds by normalizing the markup shock and defining another shock nu that is equal to lambda times mu. But if you think about what that means, it means that in order to get a 1 percentage point increase in inflation, you need a shock, microfounded shock that is of an order of 500%. So it means if the steady state markup of firms is 12.5%, it means that the desired markups of firms has increased to 75%. So what this is saying is basically the way the New Keynesian model is generating inflation out of the supply shock is saying, there's a very small fraction of firms that is increasing their price by 500%. And that's giving you 1% of increase in inflation. So, when you think that inflation, when you have supply shocks increases by more than that, then you start saying, this is kind of like uncomfortable. And so, why is this happening is because the countable friction is kind of like it's like a straight jacket. It implies the same degree of rigidity with respect to demand and supply. And so that's the motivation is, can we break that so that we have shock dependence, which is what we think is an easier way of matching the data. And so the model that I'm going to present has that feature in a microfounded way. So this is going to be an islands economy. So the geography of the model is a unimass of islands and a mainland. I'm going to have this in 2 periods. I can do this in infinite horizon, but for the sake of the presentation, 2 periods. So something that I'm going to call the present, which is in the short run where the pricing friction is going to arise, and the future, which is the long run. 3 agents, households, firms, and the central bank. And the focus in the presentation is going to be on the present, where there's going to be decentralized trading in order to preserve the information friction among consumers. And in the future, there's a frictionless economy, a mainland where prices are flexible. Okay, so that's not very interesting. And it's easy to do this in general equilibrium. We have that in the appendix, but for the presentation, I'm going to do this in partial equilibrium. Okay. So households, there's a unimass of households on each island. They have heterogeneous information. Households are indexed by J. And so they have utility over 2 periods. There's a discount factor beta times theta. I'm going to assume quadratic utility for the sake of the simplicity. I don't have to do this, okay? But it makes the expressions kind of a little bit easier. And this is subject to a budget constraint. So the good little c is the good in traded in the short run. Big C is the good traded in the long run. It's a numeraire good, so we have normalized its price to 1, and this is equal to income, which I'm not going to specify here because this is in partial equilibrium. Okay, and theta is going to be the demand shock. This theta here is the discount factor shock that you see that. So this good C, little c is traded in these islands in a decentralized market. The price is going to be sticky or flexible is denoted by little p. So this is the price that is going to be sold in the perfect Bayesian equilibrium model between the firms and the consumers. Now the good capital C, as I said, is a numeraire good, is bought in the centralized market, and the price of the bond Q is set by the central bank. Skip that. Firms. And in each island, there's one firm which is a monopolist and is setting a price. There's a real marginal cost K, that is the supply shock, and the firm sets a price P. Okay, information. So, you know, as I already explained, the aggregate state is given by theta and K. So the realization of the demand shock and the realization of the supply shock. Households on each island, a fraction alpha is informed, and the fraction 1 minus alpha, the complement, is uninformed about the aggregate price. And there's a distribution of alpha across islands because I want to have heterogeneity across islands. That's going to give me that some islands adjust, some islands don't adjust depending on alpha, and that gives me allows me to define a Phillips curve in the aggregate economy. Firms, by assumption, are informed about the state of the economy. Okay, so let me show you the demand shocks result. So the state here, I'm going to shut down the supply shock just for a second. I'm going to show you the full kind of what I have the two at the same time, but this is easier. So the state now is given by the realization of theta, and K is a constant K0. Okay, I'm shutting down that shock. Now I'm going to define the flexible price equilibrium and the sticky price equilibrium. So these prices are what you would expect them to be. Is the prices that the flexible price is the price that would prevail, the monopolistic price under full information. That depends on the state. And there's a sticky price P0, which is what you would expect as well, is the price that prevails, but set by the monopolies when there are no shocks, or the same price as in steady state. And so the proposition says there is a cutoff in alpha such that above the cutoff, so when there's enough informed consumers, the firm posts a flexible price, and below the cutoff, the firm posts a sticky price. And the proof is basically working through the IC constraint of the firm. So the firm, basically in this game, the firm has an incentive, it has an incentive to post high prices. That can be kind of convincingly given as a price in the market, but that cannot be an equilibrium when alpha is below this cutoff alpha bar. So but basically alpha bar is the cutoff in the fraction of informed consumers that make flexible prices credible in the sense that the incentive compatibility becomes slack. And the firm is basically relying on the presence of enough informed consumers in order to credibly adjust the price. Below that, the firm incentive compatibility, these prices of the flexible prices are not incentive compatible, and therefore the natural equilibrium to consider is a sticky price equilibrium where the price doesn't adjust with the shock. Okay, and so that's the result. Like I said, for a high enough fraction of informed consumers, the flexible price is credible and maximizes profits. Now, supply shocks. Now I'm going to shut down the demand shock and just have I'm going to shut down the demand shock and turn on the supply shock and define a flexible price, PK, that depends on the cost. And it is the same price that maximizes profits when the cost is known. And the result is for any alpha, this flexible price PK is consistent with a perfect Bayesian equilibrium. And the reason there is that there's no IC constraint. When shocks are high, firms increase prices because costs are higher. That leads to lower demand, but that's credible because that's what profit maximization implies. So in other words, to understand why is this credible is because if costs are low, what the firm wants to do is to lower prices and sell more. So as you can see, the logic is very different. So in other words, like Hassan told me when we're sitting down, is in this case, incentives are aligned, so to speak, between the firm and the consumer, different from the demand shock case. And then I can also have the two shocks turned on and define the same price PK that I'm not going to call, I'm calling now P0K. So this price is demand sticky, but supply flexible. So this is kind of like a very extreme version of shock dependence. The price is adjusting with supply, but at the same time is sticky with respect to demand. Okay, and so there's a cutoff alpha bar such that if alpha is below that, firms post this price and is consistent with a perfect Bayesian equilibrium. So this gives you a flat Phillips curve, but a Phillips curve that moves up and down with supply. So why should we care about this? For policy, the consequences of shock dependence are very different. So because prices are flexible, when you have supply shocks in this case, the central bank should not act in order to lower inflation. Okay, so that's this I'm simulating output gap and inflation for different values of the reaction of the central bank. So if the central bank doesn't do anything, this is the interest rate, then there's no output gap. And so there's nowhere to loss. Instead, if the central bank increases the interest rate, try to mitigate inflation, the rising inflation, first of all, with a flat Phillips curve, it is not very effective in terms of bringing down inflation, and it generates a negative output gap. So it hurts welfare. So as you can see in this model of shock dependence, there's no price dispersion when inflation rises after a supply shock. It's a very different prediction. So the takeaway from the paper then to wrap up is, as types of pricing frictions that are considered, we have time dependent, state dependent, and here we're trying to kind of entertain a different type of way of thinking about sticky prices, which is shock dependence. It depends what shock hits the economy to whether prices are sticky or not. And we're not kind of like married to our particular micro foundation. This is one model that gives you shock dependence. But besides, we think that it is useful to think about shock dependence when trying to think about inflation, aggregate inflation dynamics. And to summarize, what our micro foundation relies on is firm incentives. So in the case of demand shocks, firm incentives generate a strategic friction that gives you stickiness. When you have supply shocks, firm incentives generate no strategic friction, and you have price flexibility.
All right, we have time for questions.
Ludwig?
I was wondering if you thought about a different model that gives you shock dependence, which has, for example, the kind of flavors that Hassan was talking about. You have multiple sectors or multiple Phillips curves. For example, you could have wage Phillips curve and a price Phillips curve. The extent that the wage Phillips curve is stickier than the price Phillips curve, you could have supply shocks that have large effects on prices because they're happening, somewhere in between, the upstream labor and downstream goods. Whereas if you have a demand shock, both Phillips curves are kind of operating, and then it's flatter. Might be interesting to contrast your model with the prediction of them.
So I had not thought about that model. I think it's very interesting. So it's relying more on wages, you mean?
Yeah. Whenever you have a model with different, stickiness, prices or wages, right? As soon as you have a supply shock that happens somewhere between those sectors. So for example, imagine there's a firm that produces using labor, wages are sticky, the firm's goods are also sticky, the firm's prices are also sticky, but less so. Then a supply shock that hits that firm, the TP shock, can pass through to inflation at a higher slope than if you had a demand increase, because the demand increase kind of operates in both those scopes.
Yeah.
Anyway, just think about it.
I guess the more general point is, I'm fully on board with I think what's exciting to me as it's thinking about this is the idea of shock dependence in general.
Totally.
And yeah, here's one model that we thought about, I need to think about it.
I guess in Hassan's world, right, if you have supply shock that hit differently in the network, to the extent that I'm understanding it correctly, that also has different effects on inflation right away, right? For a similar reason. that, you know, if it hits more downstream sectors, I'm guessing there's less rigidity, you know.
But you do need wage stickiness in your model. Do you need that?
You don't necessarily need, but you just need multiple sectors.
Yeah, no, I need to like, I think about that.
But yeah.
Okay, so when you have more than one sector, then if demand shocks originate from a particular part of the network versus supply shocks from another part of the network, then obviously you will have different propagation, right? And I think like another thing is that in even the same network, demand shocks propagate upwards or upstream, whereas the supply shocks propagate downstream. So
Right, so that could be,
but you do need that, like that's.
but you need to make that extra assumption.
Right, yeah, exactly. So you need that heterogeneity, like the physical prediction between that
Yeah.
network economy,
Yeah.
the shock and the location of the network need to be correlated in a particular way.
I think you guys are more intelligent.
I was just wondering, you have expression of the adaptability history on the slides?
I apologize, I don't have it. I can write it on the board if you want, but not now.
No, we can talk about it. Yeah.
So what happens is you, on the right hand side, you have the alpha. And so the alpha, you can see very quickly when alpha increases, which is gonna be the parameter in front of the demand of the uniforms, which is not sensitive to the price of the fund setting, because therefore, then it becomes easier to, and then what you do is to get the cutoff, you just, you know, you just substitute out alpha and give it the cutoff. So it's trivial. It's in my other papers. Okay.
You showed us like the existence of replication equilibrium, but was there also uniqueness, or are there perhaps other prices?
It's a take on the game, so there's no uniqueness. So you need to make a selection arguments. And the way I do it in the previous papers is by focusing on the best equilibrium for the farm. And that gives you the stickiness. Equilibrium is the best for the farm actually when alpha is low, and the other one is the best when alpha is high. So you need to make that type of the selection. Right?
Just another question. The supply shock that you're looking at in your model is like kind of like a TFP shock, right? Like
It can be a TFP shock, it can be kind of an imported goods price shock. It's just, you know, this is just here in the partial equilibrium model, it's just a marginal cost. So whatever you think is marginal cost, I can do that. We also have some discussion about, you know, market costs. You know,
but like in the case of model, TFP shock, even though it's usually considered like a supply shock, it would be like a demand shock in the Keynesian model tradition, right? Because it doesn't affect markup.
it depends on impact. So, you know, the Hazel and Reno recommends nice to be, they put it on as a supply shock. In the table.
But it doesn't.
Now, if you have the three equations, and you see the Keynesian model is gonna, you know, you're gonna have the output gap. But here is, you know, the way we're thinking about it is really kind of as a supply. Yeah.
There's only writing what
So again,
you don't rewrite the model in web relevant in terms of the gap, you just slow.
yeah, in our model, we do have a well. I don't know if that's so, you know.
No, but in the Phillips curve, you write the output deviation from Steve said don't have the alpha gap deviation from back to right, but your price is up.
In the Keynesian model or in the scientific model? In our model, we put it in the general equilibrium version, we put it in the marginal chart. In the marginal cost.
Right. I'm saying, so he's thinking about the standard deviation line.
Yeah, no, I understand.
Why you substitute that out, and then that thing becomes it goes into the natural rate, or it becomes a one short. That's what he's thinking.
Maybe we can discuss it, because I don't want to eat up on it, that's presented.
Okay, thanks again. So the last paper is the underlying timeline, so 25 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Briefing, for the nice introduction, and thank you for program committee for having our paper here. So this joint work with Brian Meyer from Atlanta Fed and Brian Prescott from Washington St. Louis. So let me give you some brief idea of what do we do here. So we use a novel survey conducted by Atlanta Fed. I'll give you background information on that. We document 3 startup effects. Now, first of all, firms lowered their 1 year ahead unit cost expectation in the early months of the pandemic. Okay, but as the pandemic continues, firms quickly increase their unit cost expectation. And the second, as we track firms, not only their mean forecast, but we look at the whole probability distributions, we can look at the higher moment. So what I'm going to show you later is, if you look at the balance of risk, entering the pandemic, the balance of risk was with downside, okay? But early, 2021, 2022, excuse me. However, upside risk clearly outweighs potential for downside risk. Okay. So finally, connected to all of the discussion here, we look at the impact of supply chain disruptions along with labor constraint. Okay. So what I want to show you here is, even after we control for all the demand factors, so the supply chain disruption still have a significant and positive impact on their firm's unit cost expectations. Okay. So let me give you some background information on the survey. So this is an online survey of about 500 C-suite executives, CFO, CEOs, and business owners, in fact, 6 districts. Basically, it covers the firms within the 6 states in the southeast part of the United States. The survey has been filled continuously since October 2011 on a monthly basis. So currently, we have roughly about 13 years of monthly responses. Okay, so that's a huge amount of firm level survey, so far as I'm concerned, for the United States. Now, the survey asks probability questions in a similar manner to the New York Fed survey for the household. Okay. Also, we ask some better questions for use of research and policy guidance. Okay. So here's a questionnaire. Okay. So I'd like to emphasize 2 unique features of our survey. So the business owners would assign probabilities, right, to these 5 pre-specified bits. Okay, this is the first unique feature, because if you think about almost for all other firm level surveys, either you ask overall price increase or decrease, or you give me a number, right? But here we get a whole probability distribution that would enable us to calculate not only the mean or median, we can also get a higher moment, like what I said, uncertainty and risk. Okay, first. Now, second, and most importantly, so far as I'm concerned, differ from all other firm level surveys that ask for overall price or inflation. We focus on firms' own unit cost. Okay, as well known from New Phillips Curve, price depend on marginal cost, right? No doubt. But the question is how to approach firms asking for their nominal marginal cost. So at the beginning of the survey, going back to 2011, so Atlanta Fed did many face-to-face interviews. So asking firms how to reveal this nominal marginal cost. Right? So results from this survey are to ask firms for their unit cost, including both labor cost and non-labor cost. Okay. Now realize that unit cost for firms, for the CEO CFOs, is equivalent to what we economists will think about nominal marginal cost. Okay. So that's the language firms most widely used to identify the cost of producing the net unit of good or service.
I thought unit cost to the average cost.
Yes. So when we ask firms, give us a unit cost, right? Depending, for some firms, they only produce 1 product or 1 service. These are, it's very easy. Okay. So for the large firms, they produce many goods and services. Either they give us the average cost, right? Or they give us something like the unit cost for the typical goods and services that account for largest share of their profit. Yeah, you're right. So let me spend a couple of minutes here to convince you quality of service is good. Okay. So as firms here on panel, include the firms within 6 district. Excuse me. So this is really the issue of being represented. Okay. In terms of both firm size, large or small, medium, and industry composition, the BAE panel is roughly reflective of the US economy. Okay. And second, we maintain a relatively high response rate, about 40%. This is the comparable, correct me if I'm wrong, because this roughly 20-30% response rate at firm level survey, both in US and abroad. Now, another concern you might have is this. We track the same firm over time. Okay. Would this firm learn over time or so-called attenuate effect? We don't see. Okay, there's no significant attenuate effect in terms of both forecast error or forecast uncertainty. So we interpret this as evidence that the firm that really tell us what's going on with their unit cost, and the way we track same firms over time will not bias their responses. Right. If you do some simple scatter plot, you will see firms' expectations are almost perfectly correlated with their outcomes. Okay, not only at the firm level, but also at aggregate level. Okay, so what you see here, this solid line is aggregated year-over-year unit cost growth over the last 12 months. Okay, according to the weighted bias industry share for overall GDP. We plot the firm's year-over-year unit cost growth against GDP deflator inflation rate. Do you see that these two measures are almost perfectly correlated? Now recall that we never ask firms about their aggregate inflation or overall price level in general. Instead, we ask for firms' unit cost, a concept they know about and they care about, and that matters for their pricing this year. By simply aggregating using the industry weight of overall GDP, we get a measure that tracks US inflation very well. Look, in turning points at the beginning of the pandemic, as the pandemic continues. I could stop here. Okay, so this is my favorite graph. Yeah. So information in the BAE panel gives us unique signal about what's going on with aggregate inflation. So one typical question whenever I show this graph is, hey Simon, is there any sectors tend to dominate? Okay. So here we plot the unit cost realizations across sectors. So what's interesting here is this unit cost realization differ a lot across sectors. So we're not getting the same component. None of the sectors tend to dominate. Okay. So firms in the BAE panel give us the idiosyncratic viewpoint about their unit costs. So it turns out you need firms in all the sectors in order to get aggregate up into a meaningful proxy. I'll show you in the last slides. So this is in terms of perception, right, over the last 12 months. Then we move to the year ahead expectations. Okay, you see before the pandemic, firms' unit cost, a year ahead unit cost expectations almost go hand by hand with this a year ahead GDP deflator expectations from US SPR, Survey of Professional Forecasters, provided by Philip. Okay, now let's dig into some details into the pandemic period. So at the beginning of the pandemic, the firm dropped a lot of their a year ahead unit cost expectations. This is the sharpest decline we have on record going back to 2011. And this match up with those of professionals. Okay. So both firms and professional forecasters view the beginning of COVID as a negative for inflation, and see the start of this COVID on that as a negative demand shock. Okay. The supply aspect didn't come right away. It took some time, but when everybody switched, that switch was almost instantaneous. Okay, this is the first point I want to make here. Now, second, so what you see here in late 2020, especially at the beginning of 2021, professional forecasters tapered their inflation expectations going forward because they thought of this inflation being relatively transitory. Again, if you remember, this was in line with many experts and policymakers told us at the end of 2021, hey, don't worry about inflation. It was only transitory. Okay, but on the other hand, however, look at the firms. Firms viewed supply chain disruptions and disruption to the operating capacity as being much more stronger and more persistent. So we see the divergence between firms and professional forecasters view. Okay, it's very since in late 2021. right? So again, the information again from the BAE panel, unit cost expectation give us a unique signal about the inflation rate going forward. So this chart shows you a 5-year rolling average between firms' unit cost expectations against 3 other measures. As you can see, before the pandemic, firms' unit cost expectations is highly correlated with inflation expectations from professional forecasters coming from blue-chip economic indicators. Okay, but however, it's only moderately correlated with the New York Fed household inflation expectations. It's almost uncorrelated with inflation expectations from the University of Michigan survey. Okay, but since the beginning of the pandemic, all inflation expectation measures, together with unit cost expectation measure from our BAE panel, tend to converge. There are many stories. I mean, I see many papers why, actually also Anna discussed a lot of literature. I'll not, spend too much time here, but it's an interesting fact. I want to show you just a correlation. Okay, simple correlation here. So,
are you calculating this? Is this like average time series correlated with?
Yeah, simple 5-year, yeah, over the last 5 years. So what's the correlation between firms, unit cost expectations, and even expecting from professional forecasters?
Are they all consumer price inflation, even for blue-chip economy?
That's a good question. They're all different, right? For example, here, University of Michigan survey asked for overall price, right? New York Fed survey asked for inflation rate. Okay. This is asked for CPI inflation rate. Okay. So the main point here, you see professionals, their view are in line with the firms, right? But firms' view and professionals, they kind of diverge from what household would tell you, especially in a low and stable inflation environment. That's a potential problem here I want to emphasize.
Is there a correlation with CPI? If it's a year unit cost, then wouldn't be more correlated with CPI?
Yeah, we tried that. We did. I mean, this paper has 92 pages long appendix. We tried all different measures: CPI, PPI, GP deflator, and also the PCE and core PCE. We did all of that. Yeah. Okay. So another interesting aspect is the inflation risk. Okay. You can think about this as a proxy for the inflation risk. Actually, this chart shows 3 simple measures. The first one, solid blue line, is simply how much weight the firm would tell you, hey, unit cost will be larger than 5%. Okay. So this dotted green line here is a weight from the sign to the highest B minus the weight of the sign to the lowest B. Right? We call it okay. So last one, dotted orange one, is the weight is assigned to the upper 2 beams minus the weight is assigned to lower 2 beams. Okay. But anyhow, if you focus on those 2 measures, we call it proxy for balance of risk. You see at the beginning of the pandemic, clearly the balance of risk was weighted downside. Okay. But the firm quickly reversed cost, starting placing more and more weight on the upper 2 beams. By August of 2020, you will see that the balance of risk, clearly the upside risk outweighs the downside risk. Okay, so we borrow from the questions Station 0 on the small business policy survey. We'll go beyond by simply ask the firms whether they have experienced disruptions to ask them what's the intensity to their supply chain disruptions and disruption to the operating capacity. Okay, so we asked this question 5 times, as you can see there. We have 11 different categories, like affect your supply delivery time, affect the production delay, and so on. Okay, for each of the categories, there are different choices: no effect, quoted at 0, or severe impact quoted at 4. In other words, if this firm tells us maximum disruption, we will get a maximum value of 44. Keep that in mind. Okay, here's a summary. Here we plot firm's disruption index, average across all firms. Remember what I said, the highest value could be 44, right? If there's 100% disruption to all 11 categories. We plotted firm disruption index against their a year ahead unit cost expectations. You see very high and positive relationship. Okay, of course, we are not arguing supply chain disruption is the only reason that push up the cost expectations. Right, the demand factors play a very important role here. That's what I'm going to show you in the next slide. Okay, couple slides. If we plot the disruption index against the unit cost of risk, okay, balance of risk there, we see a similar structure. But the potential problem is this: if you look at two supply disruption index on the top, the left one is the ISM's supply delivery index. The top right is New York Fed Global Supply Chain Pressure Index. You see the increase a lot, right? Especially since year 2020. Right? But the bottom two show us, two demand proxies or demand factors. One is order backlog index, another is new order index. You would see this measure can correlate. For example, if the firm experiences long delivery time, on one hand, it is supply shock, no doubt, right? On the other hand, it might be caused by the surge in demand. Okay, so if you want to estimate or quantify the impact of supply chain disruptions, you have to control for demand factors. Okay. So thanks to anonymous referees, we get some nice suggestions here. We take two-step approach. Yeah. So first step, we basically regress each of the supply factors. What I show you, either ISM supply delivery index or New York Fed Global Supply Chain Pressure Index. We regress each of the supply factors on all demand factors we know, right? Including order, SMS order backlog index, new order index, also our own sales gap. Okay. The idea is from equation 1, we would get a measure of, let's call it a normalized supply chain factor, supply chain disruptions that removes impact of demand factors. Okay, of course, you can keep on adding factors in. Okay, so we run regression unit cost expectations on this normalized supply chain factors after controlling for firm and time fixed effect. So this is what you see here. Right. So column 1 and 2, based on monthly data, we have columns 3 and 4 quarterly. That's why you see the number of observations reduced, right? Okay, but no matter what, the result amazingly similar. Okay, basically saying that look, the supply chain disruptions contributed positively and significantly, right, to this unit cost expectations. Okay, now put this into economics context. This coefficient would translate into between 30 and 40%, meaning that the supply chain or supply shocks, if I can use that word, supply chain disruptions and labor constraints altogether contribute to between 30 and 40% of increase in firm unit cost expectations. So we see similar picture for the unit cost of risk. Okay, so all positive there, as you can see, very similar what we had unit cost expectations. So to conclude, firms on net, so the first 8 months pandemic as demand shock, since they lower their sales, lower employment, and lower their unit cost expectations. Okay. However, as the pandemic continues, the firms quickly reverse course start increasing their unit cost expectations. And second, the balanced unit cost risk, which was initially with the downside, to shift quickly to the upside. So after controlling for demand factors, supply chain disruptions, along with labor constraints, contributed to this elevated short-term unit cost expectation risk. How much time do I have?
You're short by 5 minutes.
Oh, still have, okay, great. Yeah, I can take, 1 or 2 minutes. I put 2 papers in 1 slide. Yeah.
So quick question, can you go back to your 2-stage regression? Are you accounting for that residual being a generated regressor, the epsilon hat or no?
Yeah.
Okay. So those standard errors that we were told the next tables have control against certainly associated with epsilon hat?
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess it was that.
Okay.
Okay, so I think the motivating question from Hassan is, what's the real certain blocks like oil price, right? Contributed to this elevated inflation. What do we have? With my past PhD students, Anzidong, another professor there, so we quantify the impact of supply demand factors in inflation expectations across 84 countries, I believe. We will set restrictions to identify, demand supply shocks according to economics 101. Okay, I will not repeat, but the story here very simple. The pass-through from oil price to inflation is very limited. Okay, global wide, between 10 and 20%, depending, you're talking about developed countries, 10%, developing countries is 20% maximum, right? So demand and supply contribute to the rest, like 80%, roughly the same. Okay, demand 40%, supply 40% at 12 months ahead. This one paper. So another one is good to talk about labor searching matching model. We also have something like that. So basically, we try to look at the relationship between labor market tightness and inflation dynamics, right? During the pandemic. Turns out it works well for US and for a lot of OECD countries. So we propose labor searching matching model that can explain that. Okay, so both papers are available in my website, and these are all working papers. Please, comments are welcome. So I will stop here.
Thank you. So we have time for questions.
Like your question of the unit cost expectation, you have like these asymmetric bands, less than 1%.
Asymmetric.
Yeah, asymmetric, but also like a small range. Given what we know about the size of the price changes, right? So for example, like, from papers like Bill Zamfano or Steinson, that firms change their prices in the order of like 5%, 10%, which gives us a sense of what the idiosyncratic shocks be the costs are. I wonder that if that censoring matters, and if you think that the asymmetric nature of these bins are affecting or finding the respondents in terms of thinking within that range that you're giving them.
Yeah, we are aware of this issue. I mean, right, especially when the inflation was more than 70%. Right? So okay, I'll put it this way. Our lowest bin is unit cost less than -1%. For US, it's less a concern. We talk about Japan, it's a big issue there, right? During launch. So the deflation was a major issue there. For many years.
You're thinking about aggregates there. I'm thinking about like the unit cost of a firm can decrease by 10%,
No, we don't see that many. So I have slides not here in the appendix, right? I have one paper. So very less than like 5% of firms will say unit cost less than -1%, right? Even before the pandemic, right? So majority of firms still is between like 1% and 5%. Like I would say 85–90% of firms. Right? So the real concern we get is when inflation during such a high inflation environment, about 1/3 of firms still would put the weight on the upper two intervals. Like their cost will be between 3 and 5 or more than 5. Right. So we're thinking about expanding the intervals. If you guys have some better suggestion for that, right? Like what ECB SPF has done. Or we take a flexible beam approach. But the beauty of this fixed beam approach is that it swaps a lot of the noise and volatilities, right, compared to flexible beam approach. Right? Clearly, my favorite graph, actually, you see the clear signal about inflation going forward. Right? Correlation with the GDP deflator, it's almost at 0.98, and this is the best you can expect. Right?
Other questions?
Can you merge this data with other observables of the firm?
That's our next project.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we will take it to Central Bureau. But we were told it takes at least 2 to 3 years if somebody has.
Going back to the unit cost question, like there you could check whether, yeah, those beans are being binding or not.
Right. Oh, yeah, I love to have that to merge the two data set. I mean, what's also interesting, what I didn't show you here is we don't see in the professional forecast for the firms, expectation. You would see unit cost expectation. There's a lot of firms do like a bimodal distribution, which I don't have time to discuss here. It's very interesting, right? So we did interview with the firms, follow up with them. Why it was bimodal distribution, meaning that they were assigning like 50% probability to unit cost between -1 to 1 and 50% between 3 and 5. Right? Initially, we thought it maybe a typo. Turns out those firms do it consistently, month by month. Okay, for 6 months in a row, they're doing that. So the result from this interview is that firm planned something like the scenario analysis. Right? They said, hey, if this happened, there's a new production line. If it succeeds, my cost will be really down. But if I feel high cost. Right? So there's something really new, and so allow if you have time. Okay.
All right, so let's close the session. Thank you.